they found it. 72 years after it vanished beneath the ocean. A battleship, carrying secrets that were never meant to be discovered. When the divers descended, they expected wreckage. What they found instead changed everything. Because what was locked inside that ship wasn't just weapons, wasn't just cargo. It was a warning that was meant for us, for right now, for this exact moment in history. And when the world's top analysts saw what was inside, they went silent. Stay right there, because what comes next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew. Welcome to DeepWave Discovery, the channel where history doesn't just teach, it warns. Now, before we go any further, a quick word to everyone watching. If this is the first time here, think of subscribing to this channel like putting on a seatbelt before a long drive. One small click, but it makes all the difference. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button slowly, no rush, just like a wise person who never skips the important steps in life. And to those who've been here before, welcome back, friends. Now tell us something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your country, right down there in the comments. It's always remarkable to see how far these stories travel. In the year 2017, a team of deep-sea researchers quietly lowered their equipment into the cold, dark waters of the Pacific Ocean. They were not treasure hunters. They were not filmmakers chasing adventure. They were analysts, scientists, historians with a very specific mission to locate what many had already written off as a ghost of the Second World War. What they were looking for had last been seen in 1944. A Japanese imperial battleship, the Musashi, one of the largest and most powerful warships ever constructed in human history. A vessel so enormous, so expensive, and so strategically significant that its construction was kept almost entirely secret from the outside world. It had been sunk during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles ever recorded, somewhere beneath more than 1,000 meters of open ocean, for 72 years. Nobody could find it. And then, on March 2, 2017, Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen and his research team did exactly that. They found it. But here's where the story stops being about history and starts being about something far more important. 'Cause when the underwater cameras descended toward the wreckage, slowly, through layers of darkness and pressure, what they captured was not simply the image of a destroyed warship. What they captured was a time capsule. Perfectly preserved inside that sunken hull were artifacts, structures, and materials that had not been touched since the final months of World War II. Entire sections of the ship remained almost intact, a mechanical museum sealed shut by the ocean itself. And the analysts who studied the footage did not reach for the language of adventure. They reached for the language of economics. Because the Musashi was not merely a weapon, it was the physical result of an entire nation's industrial capacity pushed to its absolute limit. It represented hundreds of thousands of hours of skilled labor, rare materials sourced from across a wartime empire, a command and control supply chain that mobilized an entire economy toward a single strategic objective. And all of that had been sitting silently on the ocean floor, waiting. For 72 years, the lessons locked inside that battleship were unavailable to the business world. To economists, to strategists, now they were not. And what those lessons revealed about modern economic systems was deeply unsettling. Most people, when they hear the word battleship, think of cannons, think of war, think of destruction. But the researchers who studied the Musashi footage frame by frame, they saw something entirely different. They saw a business. Consider this carefully. The Musashi weighed approximately 73,000 tons when fully loaded. That is not the weight of a weapon. That is the weight of an economy moving through water. Every single component aboard that vessel, every bolt, every fuel drum, every communication instrument, every food ration stored in its lower decks had been sourced, manufactured, transported, financed, and delivered through a supply chain of staggering complexity. And here's what the analysts found when they began cataloging the wreckage. The ship was not simply carrying weapons of war, it was carrying documentation. Operational orders, supply manifests. Engineering specifications so precise that modern shipbuilders, on reviewing recovered fragments, admitted openly they were looking at manufacturing standards that rivaled anything produced today. In 1944, without computers, without digital logistics systems, without any of the tools that modern corporations consider absolutely essential to functioning at scale. Let that settle for a moment. A nation under the full economic pressure of a world war had designed, financed, and constructed a vessel of this magnitude using nothing but human systems. Organizational discipline, capital allocation executed with military precision, workforce coordination across dozens of industries simultaneously, and the supply chain that fed the Musashi, that kept it fueled, armed, and operational, stretched across an empire spanning thousands of miles of ocean. When researchers mapped that supply chain using recovered documents and cross-referenced historical records, what emerged was not a picture of wartime desperation. What emerged was a picture of extraordinary economic architecture. Raw materials were sourced from occupied territories in Southeast Asia. Steel production was centralized and rationed with calculated efficiency. Skilled labor was deployed, not wasted, across precisely identified manufacturing bottlenecks. Every resource had a purpose. Every expenditure had a strategic return. This was not chaos. This was a business model operating under the most extreme conditions imaginable. And yet, that business model failed. The Musashi was sunk within 2 years of its completion. The empire that built it collapsed within 12 months after that. And this is where the story pivots sharply, from history into warning. Because the same structural patterns that built the Musashi, the same economic architectures, the same supply chain vulnerabilities, the same fatal overconfidence in industrial power are visible today. In boardrooms, in global logistics networks, here in the financial systems that modern businesses depend upon every single morning, without ever questioning their stability. The cargo inside that sunken battleship was not just steel and ammunition, it was a mirror. And what it reflected back at the modern business world was deeply uncomfortable. There is a question that serious economists have debated for decades, a question that business schools rarely teach, a question that most entrepreneurs never think to ask until it is too late. The question is this: how does an entire economy transform itself? Almost overnight, not gradually, not comfortably, but with violent, absolute speed, redirecting every available resource. Every skilled worker, every manufacturing facility, every financial instrument toward a single unified objective. 'Cause that is exactly what Japan did. And studying how they did it reveals something extraordinary about the nature of business itself. In 1937, Japan was already moving. But by 1941, the year their empire committed fully to total war, something remarkable happened inside their economic engine. Industries that had spent decades competing against each other suddenly began cooperating. Steel manufacturers coordinated directly with shipbuilders. Shipbuilders coordinated directly with weapons engineers. Weapons engineers coordinated directly with government financial ministries. And all of them, every single moving part, reported upward through a command structure that eliminated debate, eliminated bureaucratic delay, and eliminated the one thing that destroys most large organizations from the inside: wasted time. The Musashi itself took approximately 5 years to complete, from design conception to operational deployment. 5 years. For the largest battleship ever constructed by human hands at that point in history. Modern infrastructure projects of far lesser complexity routinely take longer than that today. Why? Because the Japanese wartime economic model had solved by necessity the single greatest problem that every growing business eventually faces: the alignment problem. In most organizations, departments do not speak the same language. Finance protects budget. Operations protects process. Leadership protects legacy decisions. And while these three forces quietly argue with each other inside boardrooms, markets move. Competitors advance. Opportunities close. But in the economic architecture that produced the Musashi alignment was not a goal. It was a condition of survival. Every ministry, every manufacturer, every logistics coordinator understood one thing with absolute clarity. There was no margin for misalignment. The cost of internal friction was defeat. And so they eliminated it. Now apply that logic to the modern business world. The most dangerous companies operating today, the ones quietly reshaping entire industries. While their competitors hold quarterly review meetings, they have solved the alignment problem. It's not perfectly, but sufficiently. Amazon did not become the world's most dominant logistics network by accident. It became dominant because its internal systems were architected deliberately, ruthlessly, to eliminate the distance between decision and execution. Apple did not build the most profitable supply chain in consumer electronics history through luck. It built it by applying a wartime principle to peacetime commerce: control the critical components, secure the supply chain, move faster than the environment can destabilize you. These are not modern innovations. These are ancient economic strategies, preserved in the wreckage of a battleship, sitting quietly on the ocean floor for 72 years. But here's the part that the history books never emphasize. The Musashi's blueprint was brilliant, genuinely, architecturally brilliant, and it still failed. Not because the model was wrong, but because the model had one catastrophic blind spot, a vulnerability so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the structure itself, that no amount of industrial brilliance could overcome it. And that blind spot is the same one threatening the most powerful businesses operating on Earth today. There is something deeply unsettling about a ship that size disappearing completely. Not metaphorically, literally. One of the most powerful, most expensive, most strategically significant vessels ever constructed by human civilization simply vanished, and for 72 years, the world moved on. New wars were fought. New economies were built. New corporations rose to dominance. New supply chains wrapped themselves around the entire planet. And all of it, every single decision made during those 72 years, was made without access to the intelligence locked inside that wreckage. Now consider what that actually means. Not romantically, not historically, but strategically. Every lesson encoded inside the Musashi's construction, every supply chain vulnerability, every alignment failure, every structural weakness that ultimately contributed to its destruction, remained inaccessible, unexamined, unretrieved, while the world's economies rebuilt themselves directly on top of the same foundational mistakes, the same dangerous overconfidence in industrial scale, the same fatal assumption that complexity, once built, will simply continue to function. Economists who study systemic collapse have identified a pattern that repeats itself across centuries of economic history. They call it institutional amnesia. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It moves quietly through generations of business leaders who inherit systems they did not build, depend upon infrastructure they do not fully understand, and make decisions based on assumptions that were formed in a completely different economic environment. And then one day, the ocean floor shifts. A supply chain breaks. A currency loses stability. A dominant industry discovers suddenly, without warning, that the foundation it has been standing on was never as solid as it appeared. This is not theoretical. Between 2020 and 2023 alone, the global business community witnessed supply chain collapses that economists had mathematically predicted for decades, but that corporate leadership had systematically ignored. Semiconductor shortages paralyzed automobile manufacturers overnight. Shipping bottlenecks froze retail industries that had operated confidently on razor-thin inventory margins for years. Energy supply disruptions rewrote the financial projections of entire national economies within a single quarter. None of these events were surprises to serious analysts. They were all, every single one, visible in the historical record, encoded in previous collapses, documented in the wreckage of previous systems that had grown too large, too confident, and too structurally rigid to adapt when the environment shifted beneath them, just like the Musashi. And here is the most important lesson that Sunken Battleship carries for the modern business world. The Musashi was not defeated by an enemy more powerful than itself. It was defeated by accumulation of small vulnerabilities, accumulation of unaddressed structural weaknesses, accumulation of strategic blind spots that individually appeared manageable, but collectively became fatal. 17 torpedo hits and 19 aerial bombs. Not one single catastrophic blow. Accumulation. This is the pattern that serious entrepreneurs and business strategists must learn to recognize, not in their competitors, but in themselves. In their own supply chains, in their own organizational structures, in their own financial dependencies that have quietly grown so deep, so entangled, so assumed, that questioning them feels almost unreasonable, until the ocean floor shifts, and then questioning them is no longer an option. The Musashi sat silently for 72 years, carrying its warning, waiting patiently for someone to descend deep enough to listen. The question that every serious business mind must now sit with is not, what was inside that battleship? The real question is this: what warnings are sitting silently inside your own business right now that you have not yet descended deep enough to find? Because 72 years from today, someone will be studying the wreckage of the economic systems we are confidently operating right now. And the only question that will matter then is whether we saw it coming and chose to look.